Hello everyone, today we talk about the wars of the so-called Second Lombard League. Today we will not look at Frederick II's entire warfare, nor at the same Italian communal one during the same reign of the Swabian monarch, because indeed in these clashes actually many different actors that did not belong to the league participated. For example, I don't think today we're going to browse the famous siege of Viterbo by the Hohenstaufen Emperor. Equally, there is a lot going on also in other countries, and Italian communes are also clashing between one another. So this is a pretty vast arc of military history that we can't reduce. As we will see, you know the length of this video in advance. I'm not sure whether to do it in two parts because there is a lot of military history to summarize just focusing on this subject. I recently, last month, made, actually in June now, a video about the wars of the First Lombard League, so the clashes between the Lombard League communes and Frederick II's grandfather, Frederick I. There are lots of interesting parallelisms to draw. I'm surely going to make videos about the army of Frederick II in particular. There is a very interesting historiography on it that sort of draws an equally fascinating comparison, in fact, between the two contendants of today's video. You will be surprised to learn of something. Perhaps we will, surely we will address this in this video, but also in the one I want to make about this. So I'm trying to deal with all the major medieval wars in an introductory fashion, so that at some point we can descend. So in individual battles, there is Corte Nuova, Fossalta. These are all quite fascinating chapters. I made a video about some months ago, if I'm not wrong, about the siege of Rome by Frederick II. I discussed Frederick II's majesty ideology. So there's a lot on the Hohenstaufen. Admittedly, we should make more, but that can accompany you as a general context. You will find, of course, a list in the top 6 comments down below. In any case, let's talk about the military history of the Second Lombard League against Frederick II of Hohenstaufen. We speak of the Second Lombard League not much because the Lombard League had not been called or was not a system of alliances that fundamentally permeated in a general sense. As you know, Lombardy was, together with northern France, essentially the most developed region in Europe. And it's heavily urbanized, in particular at this point also hosting the largest arms and armor production, the finest one, also qualitatively speaking, in the old continent. So there is a lot going on, but say we simply divide First, Second Lombard League mostly on the basis of these major wars, the ones of Frederick I and Frederick II respectively. Then the Lombard League continues happening, right? Continues existing at different points under both the Ghibellines and the Guelphs. As a matter of fact, if you're interested, I made a video about medieval Lombardy, medieval Milan, and we'll come back to that point. There is a Ghibelline Lombard League, for example, during the expedition of Henry II of Luxembourg. From the other side, this is after Frederick II's reign, you have the Thalia, the Angevin Guelph League, especially of Tuscany, that, however, did involve also northern communes. It's complicated only if you have never really heard of it, and Schwerpunkt may be the best place you can find information on this subject, as for most of the military history that we cover, especially medieval wise, telling the truth. This war, the set of wars, was in fact a sustained, multifaceted contest spanning more than 2 decades, the entire generation in which the communes of northern Italy sought to uphold the liberties secured under the Peace of Constance, granted by the same Frederick I Barbarossa after the Lombard victory at Legnano in 1176. The peace had been concluded on June the 25th, 1183, between the emperor and the cities of the First Lombard League after 6 years of intermittent warfare, at least in the previous round, this previous subset of rounds, the first round, following the Imperial defeat in a Pobal, informally recognizing the commune's rights to elect their own consuls and podesta, This was already sort of what we're going with by themselves, to fortify their walls and towers without imperial license, which was a massive privilege because it was a public prerogative and, of course, one of major strategic relevance, to administer local justice in civil and criminal cases according to their own statuses, which was also a public, thereby royal imperial prerogative, to levy tolls and market dues within their districts, and to form mutual defensive associations, while still requiring annual oaths of fealty to the emperor and the provision of fixed contingents of troops and supplies whenever the imperial court or army passed through Lombardy. Right, the Fodrum was essentially maintained, public authority, but of course the imperial presence in Italy had, of course, reduced itself after Legnano, if anything. Of course, Holy Roman Emperors are always also such because they are only because actually they're crowned kings of Italy. They could have come from anywhere, not necessarily Germany. And as you know, the major change had been, which was a very important international reversal for German power, the quite fortunate marriage between Henry VI of Hohenstaufen and Constance of Hauteville, the last heiress of the Siculo-Norman royal dynasty, right? And that changes really the cards on the table, because, of course, the Kingdom of Sicily is by far one of the most powerful states in a proper state in Europe, and it has essentially a massive capacity at this point to tighten its grip on the papal states, on the Italic kingdom itself, also from Germany, which, of course, Henry VI remained emperor. In fact, you know all this stuff. Like, it's pretty basic, notorious information. If anything, we'll come back on those times because they're actually much more fascinating at the very end of the 12th century as far as Germany, Sicily, etc. It's something we will have to take care of, especially through some biography series. Frederick II was notoriously also born on December the 26th. This was prophesied as being, the day after Christ, and so obviously eschatological as, of course, divinizing terms. I shall really launch an entire branch of Schwerpunkt as a series dedicated, a forever ongoing series dedicated only to Frederick II, where in 1144 at Jesi, in the Mark of Ancona on the Adriatic, in fact, along the way, like the roads that connected to southern Italy with the north, to the same Hohenstaufen Emperor Henry VI and Constance of Hauteville, the posthumous daughter of King Roger II of Sicily, made a bit of biography about him that's really important, and as such owned of the last Norman king, William II. Frederick II, inherited that Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor, right? That was all different titling, would be Frederick I of Sicily, etc. But he inherited this complex legacy that fused the Hohenstaufen imperial traditions of the itinerant German kingship. We also had an interesting video about the Great Saxon Revolt of the late 11th century that partially illustrates it, that have entire videos dedicated to, in fact, 11th to 13th century German courtly itinerancy, and claims, in fact, to the Roman Imperium with the sophisticated Norman Sicilian system of incredibly concentrated royal administration, multi-language bureaucracy, and feudal hierarchy built upon Byzantine, Arab, and Latin foundations. I also recently made a video about the Siculo-Norman conquest of Sicily. We sort of resized a little bit the sensationalism about especially the ethnic mix in the bureaucracy. The Normans had rebuilt largely the system from scratch as a Western Frankish feudal monarchy. At the end of the day, these elements are not sort of overrated in the sense that it's not important, of course, to point out this various legacies and administrative bureaucratic practices, but they would have developed in an equivalent way, but even without that basis for that matter. And we also described the peculiarity of the Kingdom of Sicily that is important when you study these campaigns against the Lombard League, because, as you know, Frederick II fundamentally ruled from southern Italy, right? He had, of course, a very sort of metaphysically ethnic Roman sense of himself, He considered fundamentally Germany quite highly, but still in the bigger picture of a Roman Empire focused on either Palermo or hopefully Rome, as just a decentralized province in a truly ecumenic empire. We'll see this better, if anything, on more biographic videos on him, right? And so you understand also the expectations toward this heir, right? He was the first born, in his birthplace was in the sense in the market, often called Jesi his personal Bethlehem. I also preparing some videos on the tree of life. It's in Bethlehem. If you look at the Jewish etymology of that, it's basically the house of the bread, meaning it's basically the house of God, Bethel, and it's very connected also with the Grail thing, and it's in this sense not random. But of course, well, Frederick equated himself to Christ as emperor, Holy Roman Emperor, and therefore also Sol Invictus in his actual explicit titles. He was the last sovereign to ever use that. But in this sense, this as a ruler that would continuously regenerate power in the true traditional sense. In fact, there are various spurious anecdotes about Frederick, including a quote sounding like something, if God had seen my kingdom of Sicily, he would have not chosen Palestine for having Christ born. Like, so that's the scale of Frederick's magnitude, magnanimitas, the Latins would have said. And it's quite a peculiar character. Nobody, not even Kantorowicz nor Abulafia, properly encompass the immensity of this historical figure. That's why also these wars are quite relevant, because they harnessed an immense level of power and wealth, but still also to a general failure. You will see now how also ideologically the clash escalated. As much as he identified as Christ, of course, his opponents identified him as the Antichrist. But that's kind of obvious in the general sort of papal imperial struggle of the year. And literally, again, Jesi was, according to the emperor, in later refractions preserved in court correspondence and chronicles, as Bethlehem, reflecting his mother's also strategic control over southern territories secured through her marriage alliance and the retention of Sicilian regalian rights, even after Henry's death, as you know, relatively prematurely in 1197, while he was preparing a massive expedition that would have likely conquered Constantinople, as it happened 7 years later, as a matter of fact, at the hands of the French and the Venetians instead. Frederick's early life involved navigating these multicultural court influences that we were hinting at before from Byzantine, Islamic, and Latin traditions that shaped his later cosmopolitan administration. Of course, there were the Norman, the German ones. Generally speaking, the broader, the peculiar ones of the region. Actually, his favorite province in the kingdom was Apulia, right? So much so that it was called Puer Apulia, as a matter of fact. Frederick mastered multiple languages, including Arabic, Greek, Latin, and the vernaculars of his realms, and fostered scholarly exchanges across faiths at his Sicilian court by attracting translators, astronomers, and physicians from both Christian and Islamic lands. This was an old tradition of the Haute-Ville in Palermo that Frederick promptly refreshed, right? Crowned King of Sicily in Palermo Cathedral on May the 17th, 1198. This was a child under the formal tutelage of Pope Innocent III following his mother's death. Constance passed away that early. On November the 27th of the preceding year, Frederick navigated early anarchy, marked by wars with German captains who had accompanied Henry VI, and so to carve out personal lordships. There are figures like, Mark Valdo van Baila. That would be very interesting biographies. You can imagine like these German soldiers running free, like with free reins at the death of the emperor in this kingdom of Sicily that, by the way, in part had previously rebelled. There were some other branches of the Haute-Ville that had not accepted the shift towards the Hohenstaufen. And we will talk more about the implications of that in a political fashion. Like the Haute-Ville royal line had strongly wanted this marriage with the Swabians, because paradoxically, all those barons of the southern Italian and Sicilian hinterland were quite a problem for the unity of the crown. But in any case, I would like to stress this again. I already done it in the video about the Siculo-Norman conquest of Sicily. The King of Sicily was freaking enormous. Like the sheer amount of resources that this kingdom had, it was something at some point also in the capacity, in the political, statute, tax collection control, surpassed the income of the Kingdom of France, right? It's something utterly insane. As much utterly insane is the lack of popular attention, often sort of treated as, do you know that the Normans actually also conquered Sicily? And it stops there. Like there is not actually a history of the reign or its military capacity, the actual campaigns, the Hauteville possessions in the Holy Land, and their control of the North African coastline, the invasions of the Byzantine Empire. I mean, this is basic history, of course. Like there are people discussing this, but it's heavily underrepresented, to say the least. Right, by far the single greatest threat to the Byzantine Empire, the Seljuks, in comparisons, are a child's play really to deal with. In any case, you have this pretty messed up situation. Obviously, stemmed from Frederick's minority. Especially in the videos about the prodromes to the Battle of Bouvines, we addressed the international situation. It's a big issue because of, as we'll see now, Otto of Saxony's sort of Holy Roman Imperial elections, of sidelining Frederick, that had its issues at home as well, so in Sicily, with baronial resistance from mainland Apulian and Calabrian nobles who rejected the tightening of royal fiscal demands, and by Islamic uprisings in the island kingdom that erupted in the western valleys of Sicily after the collapse of Norman authority. And Frederick had a way to cope with that, right? Namely disemboweling the head of this rebellion with his own spear in front of the other Saracens, and, as you know, famously deporting them to the northern Apulian strategic fortress of Lucera, where they became a veritable Islamic military colony, heavily dependent on the crown, because it was surrounded by Christians, and therefore people didn't really like the Muslims from Sicily. And that was briefly used also by the early Angevins that eventually ended up exterminating them, right? So it's quite fascinating. If you're interested, I made a video about the times and meaning of Tagliacozzo. We really must do Benevent, absolutely. That with Tagliacozzo and Markfeld are by far the single most important battles of the 13th century after Bouvines. Now, these southern uprisings, by the way, saw the forced relocation and reorganization, as we were saying, in fact, of the same Islamic communities from the mountainous interior, where they carried out guerrilla war. It was actually Sicilians. I mean, there were, say, Saracens, but there were also Christians among the Saracens, even in the heyday of the Saracen invasions. Into the fortified colony of, as we said, of Lucera and Apulia's loyal military contingents later deployed in the Italian campaigns in the north as well. And this, again, there is this prejudice regarding the army of Frederick II being so complete or advanced, whatever. Look how his Saracens in a time in which Western warfare was about all heavier cavalry and infantry. This guy had archers and lighter, and so. Like, how did this actually change? Like, there isn't much of aside from skirmishing, sort of scouting, exploring, so like, you can't do that much with them. Also, you have the highly drilled professional units of crossbowmen by the Lombards that surely play a much important field. So there's a bit of an idea of hyper grandiosity of the army, like of Frederick II immediately allegedly translating into his military forces. This wasn't quite the case. Don't get me wrong, it was a hell of an army, but still pretty much in line also with one of his opponents, right? That were indeed also, that's essentially the most civilized forces in the world at that point. Now, Frederick's regency was notoriously marked by popes such as Innocent III, who, as I also described in the video before yesterday, the one about Franciscan mendicant art in general, was easily, again, one of the top 10 people, at least in the history of mankind, and who literally saved Western Christendom and sort of allowed for Latin, Germanic, Celtic, Western Slavic, and beyond civilization to literally explode right in this century. and emphasized feudal ties with Sicily, because remember that the Kingdom of Sicily had been founded by the Normans, essentially more or less on behalf of the papacy, with in fact the recognition of not just large papal prerogatives, autonomies in sort of as far as clerical possessions in southern Italy, including some papal states enclave like Benevent, etc., but also vassalage to the Holy See. Right, Kingdom of Sicily did not belong to the Holy Roman Empire. It was a sort of papal creation, would always maintain a very strong connection with Rome in this sense. And these feudal ties were naturally emphasized by Innocent III, who was also one of the most legally competent people in the world at the time, in order exactly to stress the subordination of Frederick, in this case, to the papal curia, because the fear was that as this guy would have become old, would have reached maturity, he would have tried to concentrate, in fact, power from Germany. He had all his ancestral tenures in Swabia, right? I also made a video about his uncle Philip that was elected king of the Romans, king of Germany, but was also shortly afterward assassinated. So there's a very complicated picture to recompose for the same Frederick. Here also, obviously enough, to the Norman fortune, etc. Frederick would later seek to reinterpret this relation with the papacy for greater central control, actually, by treating the Sicilian kingdom as hereditary demand rather than a papal fief. His father, Henry VI, had actually pretty, for how short actually they lived, unfortunately, they died young, but a pretty solid marriage with Constance. Like, they got along pretty well, but they still, this is proven by the fact that they could do so, while in parallel stressing different ad personam understandings of this Kingdom of Sicily. Naturally, Constance was the proper queen of Sicily. She saw herself as the vessel for the rule, so that it's her son that has to become the first true Hohenstaufen king, whereas Henry VI is king himself, but sharing with his wife control, albeit trying at least, to claim at that point Sicily as part of the Holy Roman Empire, which, as we were saying, would never actually be, right? So there is this is the explosion of universalism, the early 1200s, right? And Frederick is literally in a metaphysical sense, the best incarnation of this idea. We've seen it in many theological ways, in the Bamberger Reiter video, for example, that expresses Frederick's imperial ideology and of divine transcendence, etc. So a lot of stuff. I know that these introductions are long, but you can't have the full explanation without understanding what this all meant for the world at the time to even happen. Frederick's minority years in Palermo exposed him to street life among the city's mixed, again, Latin, Greek, and Arab populations, and to different cultural exchanges that honed his pragmatic worldview. He was a very cold, stern, quite thoughtful, conscientious individual. It is also pretty ruthless for that matter, cold-blooded, quite rationalized, so an incredibly fascinating figure. With a governance, in fact, based on personal observation rather than purely theoretical feudal norms. And so the best idea fuses of connection between the Platonic and the Aristotelian. His path to the imperial throne involved election by a majority of German princes at Frankfurt in March 1212, amid a rivalry with Otto IV of the Welf House, right, of Saxony and Bavaria. They were historically sort of the opponents, as we've seen also for a very long time in the recent video about the early Salians and the early Hohenstaufen, with the Great Saxon Revolt in the late 11th century. That's how the Hohenstaufen had actually emerged to any sort of greater relevance, marrying the emperor's daughter in a moment in which everybody had abandoned him at that point. Otto IV has actually still holds the imperial title, because he's been elected in lieu of the young Frederick, and he, against sort of this promise of his of not reuniting Germany and Sicily, and the first thing he does when he's crowned is to try to do so. And so there is a major war with the papacy. There is a major war with the young Frederick II, who courageously confronted him with a much smaller force in Calabria. And so, epic moments. Eventually, Otto comes back to Germany, and he joins the coalition eventually of Bouvines with the English against the French that support the Hohenstaufen, in fact, and that victory definitely settled a big many deal of things, especially as far as the Capetian monarchy in the so-called Angevin Empire. So, also pretty notorious events, but Frederick makes it to be recognized as German ruler at that point, backed by Innocent III, who has, in fact, excommunicated the same Otto IV. Otto still enjoyed the support of certain Rhenish and Saxon lords, not so many, but still relevant for Frederick to find himself in a delicate situation. This further procession of Frederick's power culminated in his final coronation as King of the Romans at Aachen on July the 25th, 1215, only after Otto's crushing defeat by the French King Philip II Augustus at Bouvines on July the 27th, 1214. And so we'll know what we're talking about also because we already made multiple videos about Bouvines in particular. The battle proved pivotal. It weakened Welf opposition by shattering Otto's coalition of English, Flemish, and Imperial forces, allowing Frederick to consolidate Hohenstaufen claims rooted in earlier dynastic alliances across the empire, including the marriages and inheritances that linked the Staufen house to the counties of Burgundy and the Duchy of Swabia, and that positioned him as a bridge between German princely politics and southern European power structures centered on the Sicilian crown. Frederick I had reactivated some actual imperial presence in the kingdom of Burgundy / Arles, among other things. Throughout, Frederick balanced commitments to the papacy. In this youthful age, he's mostly aligned with the papal curia, including, in fact, recognition of papal rights over Sicily as a fief under the terms of the 1198 agreement with Innocent III, and the later confirmations of 1212 with efforts to consolidate power in his southern realm through administrative reforms that emphasize central sovereignty. The Kingdom of Sicily was the single most centralized by medieval standards Latin Germanic kingdom, right? And with the capacity of the king essentially to issue new laws, like to fill the gaps existing in the customs of the realm, as opposed to simply obey the latter. This gives you an idea of how truly strong royal power was, the power of the crown was within the Kingdom of Sicily, which means more resources are extractable from it. This is the point. Like, there had been accounts from assizes from kingdoms like these, like, I don't know, England, France, Sicily, etc., and we hear, for example, of a potential of legitimately even some 1,000 knights, but of course, none of these armies would be able to ever mobilize them, but the capacity was about sort of negotiating a substantial amount, wresting them from the nobility. You have the provincial assemblies of local notables that are also connected with an actual officialty of the crown, right, so as administrators, in systematic scrutiny of prior grants of land, in fact, in privileges back to the time of William II, after all those civil wars of the papal invasion and imperial invasions, to recover alienated royal demand, right? These reforms, exemplified in the constitutions of Melfi, also known as the Liber Augustalis, issued on September the 1st, 1231 at the castle of Melfi in Basilicata, after extensive consultation with jurists and officials, introduced salaried officials drawn from the royal bureaucracy rather than hereditary feudal officers, standardized taxation through the collection of the collecta and the maintenance of detailed fiscal registers, and legal codification that influenced European governance models by prioritizing royal authority over feudal fragmentation, right? You have beautiful illuminations of the Liber Augustalis that are some of the most famous iconographic sources for late 12th, early 13th century Sicilian arms and armor with German elements, etc. Peter of Eboli, right, being sort of the key name there. We always use them, and also including in this video. The aforementioned code created one of the earliest examples of a at least concentrated or by some degree centralized bureaucratic state in medieval Europe, however you want to use the term, with elements that prefigured tendentially absolutistic tendencies, right? At least, again, also absolutist is not really a correct term, but okay, this is not the problem. Like, this video is already going to be as long as it's going to get. We will not digress to refine every single definition, but essentially, in the systematic assertion of the prince's exclusive rights to legislate, judge, and tax, to an important degree, it applied uniformly to different populations, including Longobards, Greeks, Saracens, Germans, and Jews residing in the kingdom. Prohibited unauthorized bearing of arms by private individuals or barons to curb baronial power in private warfare. This is a big deal. What is fascinating in Frederick's rule is how face-changing it was on the basis of the peoples he was coping with, right? With the Sicilians, it was in a way; with the Lombards, was in another; with the Germans, in another. So, this tells you also how intelligent he was to a great degree. And here, for example, the pacification of a kingdom, like monarchies had, in many ways, failed, right, at this gradual process of disarmament for the sake of sort of civil development, general security, greater subtle control, etc. Here, Frederick can do it in Sicily. In Germany, it was much more complicated, to say the least, not least because there wasn't much of a state, actually, that, in fact, under Saint Frederick II was starting being forfeited by the same emperor. The edictum in favorem principum is actually one of the most important laws in German, medieval German history, and I have plenty of videos on that subject as well. Frederick also established a standing army of professional knights and infantry, supplemented by the loyal Saracen forces of Lucera to reduce dependence on unreliable feudal levies. This was actually working like any other army. Like, you may hear this standing professional army, in the sense that he de facto had at his disposal a congruous amount of troops without always needing to recall them, to re-levy them, right? He had them billeted and maintained with some stipends here and there. So it's really common, right? What we intend by standing army is something that mostly we start indicating from also because of a certain historiographical laziness and sort of kind of modernistic bias from mid-14th century France. Philippe de Comines actually tells us in the late 14th, early 15th century that actually the French had modeled that on the basis of the great lords of northern Italy that had, in fact, actually much larger armies, 5,000-6,000 men-at-arms regularly maintained. So modernism has ruined everything also in historiography, but in any case, Frederick had a hell of an army, as we were saying before as well. He created a hierarchy of justiciars and chamberlains responsible directly to the crown for the administration of justice and finance in each province of the vast kingdom, quite diverse kingdom. By the mid-1220s, tensions, in fact, with the Lombard cities had deepened as well, right? He was king of Italy, right? He had been crowned with the iron diadem, and of course he had to act as Holy Roman Emperor in this core kingdom of the empire, the broader universal monarchy. The Lombard cities, so we go back to northern Italy, benefiting from booming textile and trade economies along the Po Valley routes connecting key alpine passes such as the Brenner and the Septimer to Mediterranean ports of Genoa and Venice, viewed imperial demands for the restoration of regalian rights, including the nomination of podestà. There was essentially the head of the communal army, right? He had to respect in arms also the local statutes. The commune ran the business, but he was this sort of both legal and tendentially also increasingly military expert. And so it was a person of truly public standing. The collection of the aforementioned fodrum, the massively expensive fodder for war horses, for the military expeditions, and other traditional dues, and the exercise of high justice as threats to their hard-won self-governance developed since the 11th century, through merchant guilds that controlled long-distance commerce in clothes, spices, and metals, and through consular systems that empowered urban elites of both noble and popular origin to manage communal affairs independently of episcopal or imperial oversight. All right. We have the privilege of seeing this in perspective after the first wars of the wars of the First Lombard League. The people, the petites, right, had started knocking at the knights, at the nobles' door as far as their share, their due, considering how important infantry had been against Imperial and Ghibelline forces. Right, and so there is this institution, the popolo, which stands for not simply people. It's not much a classist division, but essentially it's all those citizens that basically do not have a higher by estate, a higher access to the consulate that had been effectively the military, the knightly regime that had run the communes up to that point. There was a great deal of privilege associated with being part of the consular class, namely, if your war horses, massive stallions, it's just like having, I don't know, a Ferrari or a private jet or something in your possession, that you could be partially recompensated, refunded. It's a bit like the equus publicus in Rome, like the consular citizen soldier just pays as a privilege and a duty to, with his own resources, to go to war, was inverted for these noblemen that were considered as superior in knightly form. And so the people create this popular militias, essentially, that act also as a political force in the commune, and they start negotiating, often in arms, like blocking the narrow city streets with their thickly packed infantry, where cavalry in open field was at this point probably sort of winning, right? Even though the same Lombards had literally withstood, albeit before being saved by their own cavalry for quite prolonged engagements, the full might of Imperial cavalry in the field, and we'll see this now also during the wars of the Second Lombard League, and they wanted their own share, right? So they called the podestaion that establishes this greater, that should negotiate, should be an external force that maintains order. And at this point, the Italian communes start heading towards some proper statal dimension. Up to this point, they weren't properly states, as we understand it, but a sum of estates and councils, etc. At some point, the commune emerges through the wars against Frederick II as the sole power above all these other organisms, fundamentally. This is incredibly important because it tells you what kind of forces were agitating within the cities. Look, it's by far the single most urbanized and richest per capita region in the entire globe, right? So going at war with it requires in and of itself a universal power, just like Frederick could and would have. There are lots of other sort of moral, political, cultural considerations to do. This is a military history video, technically. But while talking about the context, we don't have all the time in the world, right, for the same. You have plenty of videos on 13th century Italy, the Holy Roman Empire, Frederick II, the general of the Kingdom of Sicily, etc. So you can check that out. The various progression from the consular to the popular regimes, etc. In 1225, Frederick convened a diet at Cremona for Easter 1226. I have a video on medieval Cremona if you're interested, and you can understand from a very peculiar episode encoded in its very coat of arms, as a matter of fact, how these Lombard cities run by these pretty sort of not exactly very sensitive to human life, knights, that they essentially believed to hold the empire. They truly believed to be the Romans and the Lombards at the same time that had the Imperium, and that essentially any ruler pivoted around them as opposed to them being some sort of subjects, right? And of course, there was a history of alignment and cooperation with emperors, right? Of course, the war of the First Lombard League had highlighted sort of all the risks, all the general purposes. Medieval civilization was expanding, so obviously Holy Roman emperors would try to subdue the Lombards, but in general, right, the idea that there was a king and emperor that settled issues, that exercised justice, that had this sort of Solomonic and universal authority that could co-opt local, etc., was pretty much out there. There had been very positive reigns, the ones, for example, the same Conrad III of Hohenstaufen, right, the uncle of Barbarossa. So this was completely within the norm of traditional world, right? On this occasion, Frederick invites the Lombard podestà in placing on the agenda the restoration of rights in Lombardy, preparations for the long-delayed crusade that he had vowed to undertake for the Pope and Christendom, in the suppression of heresy that had spread among certain urban populations, the Cathars, mostly in the most advanced cities in Europe, in fact, many among the same northern Italian centers. Cremona, a key Ghibelline stronghold at this point, was strong. And so with that confidence that we said before, but also quite aligned with the empire for now, in fact, with strong imperial ties dating back to earlier Hohenstaufen support during the wars against Barbarossa and to its strategic position on the Po that allowed control of river traffic, hosted multiple such assemblies. Right, Cremona is very central. There are, say, if you look at the Po Valley, all the various districts are like in a fish skeleton, they're all aligned in a diagonal way, one after the other. Cremona stands a bit like is a sack in between, right? And it's very central. It's close to Milan. It's close to Piacenza. It's close to Emilia, to also partially to Treviso and Marche. So it's very important, central point of reference for Lombard politics, right, and policy. Hosting such assemblies where Frederick aimed to leverage ecclesiastical support against communal autonomy by presenting himself as the defender of orthodoxy and imperial law, using these gatherings to display legal acumen in the interpretation of earlier charters and to court German princes whose military contingents he would later need from across the Alps. The cities, suspecting threats to their prerogatives and drawing on the example of Sicilian power concentration that had subordinated local autonomies to royal officials, revived the Lombard League. In March 1226 at Mantua, near the church of San Zeno al Mozzo, this is quite fascinating for a number of reasons we'll see now, because this posture is aligned with the aforementioned awareness of not just what had happened during what had caused the first Lombard League to begin with. Of course, the Lombard cities are something very different from the Kingdom of Sicily, that is a feudal power, had not had for this reason the same level of communal urban development of the north. So we will, if you're interested in this stuff, perhaps make separated videos on the subject. But they were quite aware of the fact that, of course, Frederick aimed, like pretty much all rulers of that era, in a full traditional understanding present across all the world at this point, that, of course, he would have attempted to subdue some of these centers, like for his own purposes. And so this was a very sort of sensible precautional measure. This revival built on precedents from the first leagues of resistance to Barbarossa between 1167 and 1183, fostering a network that included economic pacts protecting merchant caravans across Allied territories by guaranteeing safe conduct and mutual compensation for losses, and drawing from Roman law traditions of the Corpus Juris Civilis to justify collective action as a legitimate societas capable of acting as a single juridical person. This is also incredibly fascinating, not just because of, naturally, the very highly developed level of civility in literacy and legal culture, etc., but because Roman law in many ways had been, yes, autonomously revived by the Lombards and not simply as a transposition of the Theodosian, later Justinian code into sort of 11, 12, at this point 13th century Italy, but actually, in fact, using it to fill the gaps, as we said before, as Frederick did so as a ruler in this house, as literally a biker of Christ himself on earth. Still here, the Lombard League revived the same Roman law. The same emperor, by the way, had fostered Frederick Barbarossa of the Constitutio Habitat to strengthen his own universal power. One, just like at least originally in the Byzantine Empire, where essentially the emperor controlled the church, right? So this was also the perspective of wealth-giving struggle as it was mounting. Projecting this on their own, like they are actually a power that is capable of enforcing, as we've seen before, public prerogatives, and it acts as one organism, right? They are able to leverage this power from the same juridical foundations that paradoxically the Holy Roman emperors had tried to revive through, in fact, the recovery and the study of Roman law that happened also through Lombardistic juridical tradition, right? The Second Lombard League, though not formally distinct in legal continuity from its predecessor, as we were saying before under Barbarossa, because again, it was normal for leagues to exist to begin with, right? We shouldn't be too categorical about it. There were also different members depending on the situation. Functioned still as an innovative federal experiment. It drew legal inspiration, as we've seen, from Roman corporate traditions, adapted to medieval Italian contexts. Don't underestimate, because we've seen it also in different videos, that there was actually a massive continuity in municipal identity, straight from Roman times without break among these the city-states of the north, also thanks to the quite civil order of the Lombard kingdom and the preservation of this quite substantious and formally effective Romano-Germanic idea that essentially as a citizen you're a nobleman in arms. That's what fundamentally this men conceived themselves, right? Importantly enough, even though they had their own social differences and they definitely were not nor democratic nor per se Republican and such, but they had a sense that they were truly freemen. So while, I don't know, in Germany or in Sicily, actually people were somebody else's people, the cities of northern Italy, the Italian communes in general, were essentially the only place in the world, or at least the top place in the world, where people were truly considered free by themselves, in virtue of their own law and their own power. After all, they were exhibiting this imperium, as we will see, also with their impressive armies as well. This system had also, of the league itself, had enabled coordinated fiscal policies that funded fortifications through proportional contributions assessed on each city's taxable wealth, and the hire of professional mercenaries. This thing was increasing, right, together with sort of a rampant economy, when the citizen militias proved insufficient, right, while operating simultaneously as an inter-civic peace association, not very differently from the German Landfrieden, as a matter of fact, that settled internal disputes by arbitration, a defensive pact against, in this case, imperial overreach, but essentially to preserve their own rights, their own public order primarily, that obligated members thus to mutual military aid, a military alliance requiring coordinated decisions on war, with a proper command, a shared council like of war by all these various cities, their military representatives, taken by majority vote in the Congress of Rectors, and an economic framework that eliminated tolls among members while prohibiting commerce with adversaries, so as to isolate imperial strongholds as well. So an incredibly advanced, refined, sophisticated political, military, and civic body, right? A massive alliance. This economic integration boosted intra-league trade in goods like wool from the Alpine pastures, iron from the Brescian and Bergamasque valleys, and spices were distributed from Venetian and Genoese entrepôts, strengthening urban resilience against blockades through shared warehouses along the Po and its tributaries, and protected river routes that allowed the movement of grain and military supplies even when land roads were contested. This strategically and logistically was a massive deal. Its defining innovation lay in the creation of the Societas Lombardorum, so the Society of the Lombards, a collective entity superior to its constituent communes, a bit like the same communes were superior to their respective set of councils. So the Societas Lombardorum was understood as an overarching power above the individual communes, governed by rectors chosen from each city for fixed terms. Right, so really, really impressive. These rectors often experienced magistrates or councils with backgrounds in local governance and knowledge of both customary and Roman law, met in rotating congresses held in successive member cities to deliberate on strategy, ensuring decisions reflected broad consensus while binding members through solemn oaths of mutual defense sworn on the Gospels and the relics of local saints, with authority that included levying proportional taxes based on city wealth and population assessed through detailed censuses of earths and movable goods conducted by communal officials. All right. There is a pretty advanced, obviously, also governance administration. This makes, for example, levying troops much easier, much smoother process. You understand here there is a tendency toward monetization. The core would be this sum of money that was put in common, and then you would hire mercenaries that were fighting in parallel with the same Lombard communal milites, right? There was a form of compensation in general, as we've seen for these two, and the infantries, the quite, again, drilled, well-equipped footmen were also equipped, right, trained in this fashion. Understand also the fact that Lombard civilization, basically, especially central Italian civilization, was burningly homogeneous, right? You shouldn't be fooled by the fact these were essentially 30 different communes across the Italic kingdom, and that therefore were all sort of different, right? They had a fierce amount of civilizational uniformity. It was impossible, right, to be that explosively advanced and not to have done this by sharing, in fact, with one another. All this also because the cities, otherwise, when there was not a common enemy, had been fighting against one another. We all know how this is one of the most powerful hybridizers, this potential destroyer. But Milan had been razed to the ground by Barbarossa, and they literally rebuilt the city from scratch. Well, okay, not the entire city, admittedly, but say that they had raised their walls. They had really suffered very heavily from that, but they simply rebuilt that and won the war. So just for telling you here what kind of moral and material forces are agitating within this massively fortified urban centers, by the way, that were truly the metropolises of medieval Europe. Individual cities accepted constraints on their autonomy, such as restrictions on independent diplomacy with the emperor or the papacy without league approval, and the requirement that podestà be chosen only from league cities or approved neutral communes, yet retaining latitude for certain alliances, at least with non-member towns, and influence over the admission of the new members through the vote of the rectors. This is very important because just as in the commune, they're very self-aware and they perfectly know that in time of war, they have to issue some martial standards where you can't basically do whatever you want, where you are under a single authority, discipline, leadership, and you have to play along because that's what makes you powerful at the end of the day. You could have had all those resources and squandering them because you're politically divided. And this was, in fact, the threat understood also during the war, because Frederick would try to co-opt various strong men and military leaders from across the Po Valley and beyond to sort of foster a sense of feudal reactivation of some sort, right? We'll surely look at figures like Izzolino da Romano, for example. He's the best example for that matter. He also married into the natural children, Frederick. Podestà, typically foreign professional administrators hired for impartiality from places like Bologna, especially for the legal standards. In fact, its local university trained as jurists in the application of both civil and canon law, or other neutral communes, mostly because, again, at the end of the day, this was a military role, right? But you can't see that overlap between the civic and the military, right? This idea of citizen soldiery and very articulated, sort of tendentially statal system, right, that the communes embodied. playing key roles in enforcing league statutes locally while navigating the competing interests of the various nobiliar houses and merchant guilds that prioritized land exploitation, commercial freedom, with especially the militas that were still holding military command and hold sway in the city, and therefore often balancing so that the trade priorities for the protection of the main routes of communication with military obligations that required the mobilization of citizen infantry and maintenance of communal arsenals. Right, you made something about Milanese infantry already from the 11th century, and we'll surely make more videos about this topic. Diplomatic maneuvering occupied the years from 1226 to 1237, punctuated by imperial diets at Cremona in 1226, Ravenna in 1231, where Frederick sought to reassert control over the Romagna, Aquileia in 1232, in the presence of the local patriarch, Mainz in 1235 in Germany, after the suppression of Frederick's own son's rebellion, famously enough, the one of Henry VII, and Piacenza in 1236 on the eve of open war. There are here very important relations, naturally, between Lombardy and Germany, but throughout this whole period, but we will only partially see it today, because, again, the video is already too long as it is, and I'm not even sure that I'm going to finish today in time. In any case, these diets served as forums where Frederick showcased his legal expertise by citing the constitutions of Melfi and earlier Carolingian and Ottonian precedents for imperial rights, and sought alliances with German princes whose contingents of heavy cavalry remain essential for any sustained campaign in Italy, while the League countered with envoys who emphasized papal-backed privileges from the Peace of Constance and later confirmations by Honorius III. The League invoked the Peace of Constance to defend acquired privileges while resisting alterations to regalian rights and imperial judicial supremacy that would have restored the emperor's right to hear appeals from communal courts and to nominate officials. Consider that these had been essentially truly imperial and royal prerogatives, and the Peace of Constance had basically yielded much of this, de facto subcontracted at least them to the communes, right? So Frederick had pretty sound legal foundations to seek restoration of the previous standards, but at the same time, it was a bit of a massive moral, political, and cultural challenge to put the communes on this. And that's why they put the Lombard League back together, right? As we've seen, we said it before already, the 1183 peace had granted communes rights to fortify, elect officials, and control local justice. This was unthinkable in Germany, right? In Germany, there were communal autonomies, but were always under a nobleman of some sort, either the bishop or the count. That's how things work. So even from a psychological point of view, admittedly, Frederick was very cosmopolitic in background, but he truly felt his role as a Roman emperor, right, and also as a German and more. So there is a lot in his legacy that makes him approach, if anything, think about his grandfather's policy against the communes as well. He was particularly cruel against the Lombards, right? Pretty cold, ruthless, etc. Like this is something that also his Ghibelline allies fighting alongside him as Lombards said, look, you're not going to extrapolate that much if you behave like this. You're just uniting them further. In fact, Frederick sort of changed a bit attitude with the aforementioned cooptations in the end. The Peace of Constance had been so important for Holy Roman Imperial law. It formed a cornerstone that later jurists trained at Bologna cited in defenses against perceived violations, including provisions for annual oaths of fealty that the League now refused to renew in the form demanded by Frederick, and for the supply of fixed contributions during imperial visits that the cities sought to limit or commute into money payments. Papal arbitration played a recurring role, with lodgments by Honorius III in 1227 and Gregory IX in 1233, tending to uphold the commune's positions, obviously enough, because they didn't want Frederick to reunite like the entirety of Sicily, Italy, etc., because the papacy was just in between. Today we don't talk about the wars that were fought between the papacy and Frederick. Right, that's why before we said we would not talk about Viterbo, we would not even talk about the papal invasion of Sicily. It did happen as Frederick was during the Crusades, and the baronial revolts in the same Sicily alongside that. So it's a pretty messed up situation. We will have to make, if anything, more medieval Sicilian warfare content, because we don't have much of that, especially for these very centuries. All these provisions included the refusal of a new oath of fealty to the emperor that would have subordinated communal statutes to imperial revision. Right? Honorius and Gregory, amid their own disputes with Frederick over the repeated delays in the departure of the crusade that he had vowed, as we've seen at his imperial coronation in 1220, and over the growing Sicilian influence in the papal states from the south through the appointment of imperial agents. In fact, some of the papal states themselves, that, as you know, had some sort of temporarily, secularly, considering the investiture controversy, some pretty unsettled, sort of nebulous political institutional relation with earthly authority, per se. That Frederick would install, of course, his own partisans in the various communes of the papal states as well, viewed the League as a bulwark, preserving papal temporal interests in central Italy as well, especially as Frederick's delays in departing for the Holy Land fueled successive sentences of excommunication in 1227, and again after his brief crusade of 1228-1229 that witnessed to the recovery of Jerusalem without bloodshed. Naturally, was just a deal, essentially, of power sharing with the Egyptian rulers, but let's say indeed the papacy wanted sort of proper sort of military bloody conquest of Jerusalem to be kept for good. Frederick denounced the League as an iniquitous society of the faithless, right? Remember, faith in whom, right? In God, that is him, right? Imposing the imperial ban and formally revoking the privileges of Constance in a solemn proclamation issued at Cremona in 1226, as we've seen. Such bans included outlawing League members so that their persons and goods could be seized with impunity by loyalists, and the confiscation of properties belonging to Milanese and other communal citizens within imperial territories, escalating rhetoric that framed the clash as both political and religious by invoking charges of heresy against those who resisted the emperor's authority as the defender of the faith, which is somehow ironic also because tendentially, in fact, the heretics tended to side with the Ghibellines, right? Even if the Ghibellines were the leaders, were not heretic, but aside from papal propaganda, indeed, there was a convergence in that direction. It's also relatively intuitive, like heretics did not side with the papal side in general. But this for telling you how much convinced Frederick was of his own universal, divine, right, transcendental power. Renewed in 1231 at Bologna with expanded membership that now included cities previously hesitant, such as Bologna itself and certain other Emilian centers, the League delayed imperial initiatives through a combination of diplomatic protests and the fortification of key passes, but could not prevent eventual recourse to arms once Frederick had secured his position in Germany. Bologna's university provided intellectual support through legal scholars of the glossatorial tradition who articulated theories of communal sovereignty, rooted, as we've seen, in Justinianic codes adapted to contemporary urban realities, arguing that the populace of a free city possessed the capacity to create binding statutes and to form corporate associations independent of imperial concession. This had been the practical legal formalization of the actual communal institutional establishment from the Bolognese jurists. Consider, again, this is a massive issue because not just these guys are going at war now, but your connections with Germany are severed as a consequence. They control the Alpine passes, right? From Sicily, you have obviously sort of pretty massive launchpad for any kind of military operation, but Germany is also to be controlled in all of this. We've seen you need reinforcements from there, but also there are lots of princes that are usurping public rights. on the wave of sort of wealth, and in the sense also probably wealth and papal policy. After quelling his son Henry's rebellion in Germany in 1235, pretty bloody story, Henry was captured, and apparently he suffered of leprosy. He killed himself by launching himself with a donkey off a cliff in Calabria as he was being moved as a prisoner from castle to castle. Imagine a guy that there had been made believe in himself he could even stand against the Sol Invictus as his father. And so all these myths that we've seen also yesterday involve from Weschenbach's references to the idea of the sort of recovery of tree of life against the Godfather and so on. This guy is cursed by God with leprosy, and he decides to kill himself, right? Suicide, saying, at least I will decide my destiny as far as this is concerned. It's not all about this massive Godfather. This is incredibly important. These are incredibly bitter, painful events that you can imagine would have massively affected Frederick, even beyond his incredibly cold, ruthless, and sort of imperturbable face. This uprising in Germany had been really pretty serious. It had drawn support from discontented princes that, or during the minority, Frederick had already tasted the sweet, liberty of usurping public rights, doing a bit whatever they wanted with the general German princely pollution, and had been suppressed by, however, a combination of military force and the assembly of the Diet of Mainz. Remember before, where Henry was formally deposed. Frederick returned to Italy in 1236-1227, crossing the Alps by the Brenner route from his Swabia to Verona with several thousand German knights and gathering Ghibelline forces under Ezzelino III da Romano from Treviso, Padua, Vicenza, and Verona. This is a Trevisan mark. Ezzelino was a former Guelph, but now he is co-opted by Frederick. He becomes the most staunch Ghibelline supporter, right, of the emperor. He controls this critical route from the Brenner to the Adige Valley down to Verona that could use its locks to stop, as it had happened during the wars of the First Lombard League, probably imperial armies from returning to Germany, obliging them, in fact, to take some incredibly long detours to reach the Transalpine world once again. Alongside Tuscan contingents supplied by loyal cities such as Pisa and Siena, and Sicilian troops that included several thousand Apulian Saracen archers and light cavalry drawn from the Lucera colony. Right, if you're interested in the role of Pisa and Siena, I made some videos about the cities. I also talked about the Sienese Ghibellinism that lasted up to fairly long in time. Check out the Battle of Montaperto if you want to see a veritable bloodbath and how politics can change for that reason. Pisa was staunchly Roman and Ghibelline in absolute ideal. The German emperors needed badly a port and the Mediterranean of the kind that in this case, like the northern Italian maritime republics could provide. Ezzelino, known for his ruthless consolidation of power in the Mark of Treviso through strategic marriages into local noble families and the systematic suppression of rival clans by exile, imprisonment, and execution, exemplified the hybrid loyalties where local lords aligned with the emperor for personal gain against communal rivals who threatened their territorial ambitions, later becoming a notorious figure whose tyranny, especially based on Mussato's tragedy and work, inspired Dante. Dante owns depictions in the Inferno as a blood-stained tyrant. He wasn't actually more or less brutal than some of his also Guelph counterparts, but definitely he was, a might to be reckoned and sort of very tough leader. Total imperial strength reached estimates of 12 to 15,000 combatants, confronting a league army of approximately 2,000 cavalry and 6,000 infantry, under the overall command of Pietro Tiepolo, son of the Venetian Doge and Podestà of Milan. Right, so very high level of representatives there. And you see how the Lombards are confident. They have less troops, but not because they couldn't mobilize more, but because they care about order, compactness, quality. All right. These numbers reflected also seasonal masters growing from urban militias trained in the use of pikes and close order formation suited for the flat Lombard plains, where citizen soldiers balanced militia service with their ordinary trade duties, and where the wealth of the communes allowed the hiring of additional professional crossbowmen, for example, insurgents when needed. Right. Consider that the Po Valley, aside from the fact it was still partially swampy or forest, that much had been cleared actually from the 12th century already, but it was in particular very canalized. Right. It was full of these ditches, etc., could be reinforced, fortified on the field, and infantry there is pretty darn strong, right? We've seen what at Legnano, the ditches and pretty sturdy infantry resistance can do against Imperial cavalry charges. Operations opened against Mantua, which submitted after a brief demonstration of force to avoid the risk of sack and the destruction of its rich agricultural hinterland, followed by Bergamo's pragmatic accommodation that secured its commercial privileges in return for nominal recognition of imperial overlordship. Right? Mantua's strategic position near the Mincio River made it a gateway for controlling the eastern approaches to the Po Valley. It reinforced essentially the continuation of the Adige Valley in the north, this broader heartlands, and for, in fact, interdicting communications between Verona and the western Lombard cities. So that it would be a robust corridor that allowed Frederick to go back to Germany, to go back and forth in case of need, having reinforcements come from the north, etc. Advancing into Brescian lands, Frederick captured outposts such as Goito on the Mincio and Montichiari on the Chiese, though resistance at these points bought time for the concentration of League forces around Brescia and Milan. These outposts guarded key fords and supply lines essential for sustaining large armies in a region where the control of waterways determined logistical success and where the seasonal rise of the rivers could isolate garrisons, too. The opposing forces faced each other near Manerbio on the Oglio, separated by extensive marshland that neutralized the advantages of heavy cavalry. Terrain was naturally chosen by the defender in this case with that purpose for some 15 days of cautious observation and skirmishing. Right, these confrontations were typical, right, historically, also in medieval times. The marshy terrain around the Oglio River system, in particular, repeatedly favored defensive infantry tactics throughout these wars, with seasonal flooding creating these natural barriers that force attackers into predictable crossing points that could be stoutly defended. If you're familiar with the military details of the Italian Wars of Independence in the 19th century between Savoy, and the French, and the Austrians, you're pretty aware that these are literally the same place. Not much had really changed in terms of this complication of the crossings, etc., from a strategic standpoint. It's very interesting to study in this also historical perspective. Short on supplies after prolonged operations in hostile territory, naturally the Lombards would be able to make their own scorched earth policy in their own territory for strategic sake. Frederick maneuvered across the Oglio near Pontevico on November 24, 1237, spreading deliberate rumors of an imminent withdrawal to Cremona for winter quarters in order to induce the League army to break its fortified position. Cremona served, as we've seen, as a reliable imperial base with strong logistical support from loyalist factions within the city and from established supply depots stocked with grain and forage collected from the surrounding Ghibelline countryside. The Lombards, deceived by the apparent imperial retreat and by reports from their own scouts, broke camp and began a westward march toward what they believed would be a safer winter position. This deception exploited the League's reliance on intelligence from sympathetic rural populations and from mounted scouts who could not always distinguish between genuine movements and feints. Imperial outposts stationed at Cividate al Piano signaled the Lombard movements by means of smoke columns rising from prepared beacons, enabling Frederick's forces to wheel about and intercept the marching column near the village of Cortenuova on November the 27th. This would become the battlefield, one of the most important clashes, in fact, in medieval warfare. We'll surely make a video about Cortenuova. The surprise element highlighted Frederick's use of coordinated scouting networks from his own side and rapid response across the difficult riverine terrain of the lower Oglio. Right? If anything, here the Saracens would have been useful. In fact, the Imperial vanguard, featuring Saracen light troops skilled in rapid deployment, as well as German heavy cavalry, however, struck the Lombard marching column while it was still extended along the road, surprising the Milanese and Piacentine units that formed the rear, and inducing initial disorder and partial flight among the less experienced contingents. Saracen troops from Lucera, trained in the use of composite bows of Eastern design and in skirmishing tactics that combine archery with swift mounted withdrawal, added a versatility to Frederick's otherwise heavy night-based forces that had been drawn from the different territories of the empire in the Sicilian kingdom. The main Lombard body, realizing the danger, regrouped around the Carroccio, near the small castle of Cortenuova, placing their backs possibly against its walls for protection, and their front shielded by a small irrigation ditch that ran across the open ground, with Milanese and Alessandrian pikemen forming the core of a dense defensive square supported by the remaining knights who dismounted to stiffen the formation. All right. These are the best infantries in the world, literally. All right. And it's very meaningful that the same knights in this sort of difficult situation, we've seen it, this is a thing we often point out also for the English armies of the 100 Years' War. It's not like these guys were programmed to fight dismounted, right? They could also, obviously, but they would, like in this case, or in other cases where you had, the French in much greater force attacking a smaller English army, of course, dismount to exploit the defense. Right? Because otherwise, the Italian communal armies were also very tactically complete. They did not need to fight just with infantry. That's not what you do. That's not what happens throughout the Middle Ages, regardless of infantry victories that every once in a while happen. The Carroccio, as you know, this large-wheeled sacred standard cart often adorned with religious imagery, including painted ones of the city's patron saints and drawn by a team of white oxen, specially selected for the purpose, symbolized civic unity and especially the people, the populace identity, and served as a rallying point in multiple engagements across the history of the Lombard communes. We've seen that the desperate Lombard infantry defense at Legnano had been carried out. In fact, next to the Carroccio, they had also an elite guard, like they had to stand their ground or die. There's this heaven and earth represented in the Carroccio. It's not really different from what we've seen with the idea of the Oriflamme in the concept of Saint Denis as the Mount of Jupiter, as the actual mountain of your power, of all the somatic body of your ancestors, spiritual and material, so to say, march with you, right, under divine auspices, right? Also, Otto the Fourth of Brunswick had used his own version at the Battle of Bouvines, so it was actually more widespread than we normally think. But the Italians, in particular, are famous for this, the Lombard League, embodying this communal pride that distinguished citizen armies, as we described them before, from feudal hosts. Overall, Lombard numbers at the moment of contact stood at roughly 1,500, 2,000 cavalry and 6,000 infantry, drawn substantially from the rotational service of urban companies rather than from a full mass levy of every able-bodied male. Right, rota systems had always naturally worked pretty much in the same way. Again, the Lombard communes cared about that. They actually had pretty militarized peasantry as well. They regularly armed them, equipped them. The countryside was often subject to all these raids in internecine strife between cities. So they knew how to arrange the right type of troops, reflecting also the sort of the investment, for example, the third estate in these military enterprises. Right, you have the noble character at the top. Mostly Milanese governance stands out, obviously, as the largest city in Europe, together with Paris. Milanese governance itself works through bodies such as the Credenza of Sant'Ambrogio that represented the popular and artisan elements, and the military companies as well, such as the Societas Fortium, the Society of the Strong, that organized the knightly estate of the city. So again, it's important to see the the strength of it. If you're interested in, for example, places like Milan, Brescia, arms and armor production, I made a video about this called Milanese armor. They're in the Middle Ages, starting exactly from the 12th to 13th centuries and beyond. Like a massive society mobilized for warfare. These Milanese institutions thus represented knightly and merchant elites who dominated decision-making in the communal councils and who organized the army on the basis of neighborhoods and guilds, fostering a civic identity tightly bound to the prosperity of these magnificent cities. Battle at Cortenuova unfolded in distinct phases that reflected both the discipline of the communal infantry and the limitations of their primarily defensive doctrine, at least in this strategic context where in fact it was not even, the Lombards had not been meant to fight like this here. They mostly find themselves into the desperate situation as their column had been outmaneuvered and part of the army had already been scattered, right? So afternoon cavalry engagements between the German vanguard and the Lombard advance guard lasted nearly an hour of repeated charges and countercharges before the latter recoiled in confusion when their flanks became exposed, spreading a measure of panic through the less steady elements of the army. Right? When the knights were crushed, obviously the infantry was not meant to resist alone. This is the most important thing. It doesn't matter how advanced the Italian armies were. First of all, feudal cavalry at this point is at its moral and technical peak. So facing German knights, also the same Ghibelline ones, in open field, regardless of the defensive ditch, whatever, is basically equating to death, right? Yet, exactly for this reason, there was nothing else but stand their ground and either die or make it out of there in some ways. This is, in fact, what happens. The Milanese and Alessandrian infantry held their position alongside those knights who had chosen to fight on foot, awaiting the main Imperial assault with pikes leveled and shields locked, while Alessandria contributed hardened troops whose experience in siege warfare dated back to the city's foundation in 1168, we've seen it in the first video, as an anti-imperial bulwark deliberately named in honor of Pope Alexander III. Right, the siege of Alexandria was terrible, and the Imperials were defeated there. Frederick then committed his heavier forces of German and Italian Ghibelline knights, but the ditch that protected the Lombard front disrupted the momentum of the charges and confined the combat space so that the full weight of the Imperial cavalry could not be brought to bear, preventing decisive breakthrough despite repeated attempts to turn the flanks as well. Right, this actually looks like the infantry taking direct frontal cavalry charges. Doesn't matter how sort of the momentum had been slowed down. We've seen it also at Courtrai. The knights would sort of literally dismount to literally crossing the ditch, then remount, and then reline up and then charge. Right, this obviously compresses them on a small, on a closed terrain. It's all more complicated. All right, and sometimes like the tip of the balance that preserved the defensive. Terrain features like ditches and canals were not merely natural obstacles, but engineered enhancements to the defensive landscape of the Po Valley, part of the extensive hydraulic works that the communes had developed over generations for irrigation, drainage, and the control of flooding. As evening approached, the arriving Saracen contingent, advancing largely on foot after a long march, could exert only limited pressure with their archery before darkness intervened and made coordinated operations impossible. Their delayed arrival limited the full integration of missile support against the dense pike formations that the communal infantry had honed through regular training on the open grounds outside their city walls. Frederick, confident of eventual victory once the full weight of his forces could be applied, ordered his troops to rest under arms in their positions for a renewal of the assault at the very dawn. Right? This shows you also how what stamina they had and how also risky the whole thing really was, because you don't know what the Lombards would have done at night the other side. And actually, the Imperials are lucky this because this pose allowed the Lombards a critical window for an organized withdrawal. Right, they preferred to get the hell out of there under cover of night, and that was a wise decision because in those conditions, like that were already desperate, they could have not done much the following they as more imperial forces gathered, right? So they conducted this withdrawal also with sufficient discipline. Like they weren't routed. The bulk of the infantry and the surviving cavalry were able to disengage without immediate pursuit as well. And so during the night, the Lombards slept away undisturbed along the roads leading westward, abandoning, however, the Carroccio with great pain, as it had become mired, or which they chose to leave rather than risk, in fact, the entire army in a night action to extract it. This was pretty big and sort of difficult to pull as well. They had all particular logistics. Things were difficult, and this also battered force that had managed to hold its ground against the full brunt of Imperial cavalry. But so you want to really appreciate as one of the extraordinary proofs of medieval infantry strength that peaked in this period among the Lombards. The abandonment symbolized a tactical retreat rather than a total rout, preserving the core fighting strength of the League for future resistance and denying Frederick the complete destruction of the Communal army. Pursuit on the following day, November the 28th, exacted heavy tolls as Imperial cavalry and Saracen light troops overtook stragglers and those delayed by the muddy roads. Thousands were captured or killed, with Milanese losses alone approaching 2,500 men, and many drowned while attempting to cross flooded rivers whose bridges had been broken or whose fords had become impassable. Right, it's deep autumn. Right, in northern Italy, river crossings during pursuit often turned crucial due to the seasonal flooding characteristic of the region in late autumn, complicating retreats and turning natural watercourses into lethal obstacles. The captured Carroccio was famously paraded triumphantly through the streets of Cremona, mounted upon an elephant drawn from Frederick's renowned menagerie, while Pietro Tiepolo was later executed by hanging after a period of imprisonment. Eventually, Frederick brought the Carroccio to Rome on Capitol Hill. Right? I made a video about that for telling you how to enshrined in Romanity this entire imperial symbolism really was. Right? Bringing an elephant, by the way, there was just a way to show, like an Hellenistic ruler, how much like the prize of victory could be sort of brought by harnessing this mastodontic forces of nature, right? There is really a deep sense also of classical imagery, as you know, in Frederick's reign, that he was particularly able to project. Indeed, the use of an elephant, one of several exotic animals that Frederick maintained in his traveling court and that had been obtained through diplomatic exchanges with African and Eastern rulers, evoked the ancient Roman triumphal imagery of the emperors of antiquity. There are instances in which elephants are represented, especially on coins during triumph in the ancient world, and served to boost imperial prestige among his Frederick's Ghibelline supporters, while underscoring also the cosmopolitan reach of his Sicilian court. It was truly understood as universal in many ways, and bringing these symbols, these exotic prizes from faraway places, was really a proof that Frederick's sway was held up to very far away lands, at the limits of the world itself, right? As also Frederick was very geographically, scientifically interested. Indeed, Palermo had been one of the most advanced cartographic centers through the work of different Islamic geographers and more. Though the Lombard infantry had displayed the same defensive virtues and also constraints as a single arm that had been evident at the earlier Battle of Legnano in 1176, where it was Lombard knights that in fact saved the day, steadfast in their dense square but primarily reactive and dependent on the Carroccio as a fixed rallying point, the full potential of the Saracens as archers capable of disrupting pike formations at a distance remained unrealized because of the timing of their arrival. Even though it's debatable whether this could have happened, it's been hypothesized. Combined armed tactics, right? Normally, however, worked with heavy cavalry and heavy infantry rather than simply lighter infantry, but still. Legnano in 1176 had set a lasting precedent for successful communal defense against Barbarossa by demonstrating that well-led citizen infantry supported by a sacred standard could withstand the charges of imperial knights on favorable ground, and that spiritually enough, also in front of the rest of Europe, that was particularly inspired by this, especially in all those subordinated estates that had been reduced to that level of moral and material subservience to the feudal system, seems incredibly relevant right at the time, and did leave some important seeds in the collective action of different communities. The imperial victory at Cortenuova did not shatter the resistance, right? It instead galvanized further alliances as cities that had previously wavered recognized the necessity of sustained unity against the renewed imperial pressure and the danger that piecemeal submission would lead to the loss of all communal liberties. As we observed before, this Lombard army was pretty sizable for the time. It was not as big, for example, as Frederick's. In 1238, Frederick besieged Brescia from early July onward, deploying a large force that included siege engines of various types and at least one elephant used both for hauling and for psychological effect, as were accounted. Brescia's flourishing ironworking industry, which produced high-quality weapons and armor from the ore of the nearby valleys, supplied arms to League forces throughout the war and made its continued resistance particularly symbolic of communal defiance. Defenders conducted repeated sorties with notable success, issuing from the gates in force to destroy siege works and to disrupt imperial foraging parties, and they successfully repelled the major assaults launched in September, in which imperial engineers had attempted to shield their advancing engines by driving captured prisoners ahead of them as human protection, only for the Brescians to counter this tactic by exposing their own imperial captives on the walls in full view of the attackers. Right, all the hatred that had been sleeping beneath the embers of the memory of the war of the First Lombard League now suddenly flared once again. And this grim exchange of prisoners as living shields underscored, in fact, the growing brutality and the calculated psychological warfare that characterized prolonged medieval sieges, where the moral constraints of chivalry convention often gave way to expediency. And this man knew perfectly what to do. Somebody is using somebody as a human shield. If they are actively aggressing you in the meanwhile, you are actually legitimized to respond and shoot on your own, right? And that's how they both proceeded. And this showed naturally an incredibly high level of political, civic, and strategic awareness, right? If you don't have a crystal clear objective and understanding, or you can't do this, even just politically. So these were two very determined forces. An October storming attempt led by troops from Bergamo, who remember were under imperial pressure to prove their reliability following recent ambiguous negotiations with the emperor's rivals, ended in failure when the defenders succeeded in setting fire to the great siege tower that had been pushed across the field section of the moat. Great also military engineering at play. These are, again, some of the largest, most powerful forces you can look at from both sides. Bergamo's troubled participation on the imperial side in this phase highlighted the shifting and often opportunistic local commitments with broader war, as individual cities continually weighed the immediate advantages of alliance against the long-term costs of imperial domination. There was also a great deal of local rivalry between Bergamo and Brescia historically. Bergamo was Ghibelline, Brescia was Guelph, at least different times, depending which faction was in charge from moment to another. Frederick raised the siege in early October after the failure of the final assault, burning his remaining machines to prevent their capture and withdrawing his army into winter quarters. The failure at Brescia preserved a key western anchor for the League's defensive system and reinvigorated the alliance, drawing in the maritime republics of Genoa and Venice with their substantial naval and commercial strengths that extended communal influence across the Mediterranean and provided both financial resources and experienced crossbowmen for the land campaigns, right? Remember, Venice had held the first peace talks between the the First Lombard League and Frederick Barbarossa was somehow also ambiguously outside of the Holy Roman Empire, but close to the events. Operations extended southward to Faenza in 1240. Faenza, lying in the Romagna along the Via Emilia, controlled vital routes connecting northern Lombardy with central Italy and the approaches to the Papal States. I made a video recently about Giovanni II Bentivoglio in the 15th century. We've seen his siege of Faenza for similar strategic purposes. Faenza had become a major refuge for Guelph exiles at this point, driven from other cities by Imperial and Ghibelline victories. After an 8-month investment, see how long these sieges lasted. This gives you an idea of the level of urbanization and fortification of the Italic kingdom. A siege that began, in fact, in August 1214 was marked by severe supply strains on both sides and by Frederick's innovative use of leather tokens stamped with imperial insignia as a temporary form of pay for his troops when silver coinage ran short, right? Some sort of notes. The city, whose population had swollen around 36,000 by the influx of refugees, surrendered unconditionally. On April 14, 1241, amid the onset of famine and the exhaustion of its food reserves, the leather tokens represented in this also a way of economic warfare to sustain the siege on parole, basically, as an emergency currency designed to maintain troop morale and discipline during extended operations when the regular silver coinage of the Sicilian and imperial mints could not be transported in sufficient quantity. Frederick granted a measured clemency to the inhabitants of Faenza despite their prior offenses and the length of their resistance, allowing many to retain their lives and a portion of their property that was otherwise confiscated or destroyed. This calculated mercy contrasted with the harsher reprisals inflicted on other rebellious places, and in particular in Lombardy, and was intended, in fact, to encourage further submission by demonstrating that timely surrender could still secure favorable terms. Papal efforts to convene a general council that would rally ecclesiastical and secular opposition to the emperor prompted immediate naval countermeasures from the imperial side as well. Gregory IX sought to assemble prelates from across Latin Christendom in order to formalize the condemnation of Frederick and to organize broader resistance, prompting the emperor to deploy the combined fleets of his Sicilian kingdom and his Pisan allies as well. In May 1241, an imperial Pisan fleet under the joint command of Frederick's son Enzo, Heinz, and the experienced Pisan admiral Ansaldo de Mari, totaling some 67 galleys of various sizes, intercepted a Genoese convoy of 27 or 32 armed galleys that was carrying a large number of legates, archbishops, bishops, and abbots from France, Spain, England, and northern Italy toward the intended council site. Right, this is particularly interesting. Obviously, the Pisans are staunch Ghibellines. Genoese were their greater rivals, siding with the papacy. Many of these Italians have occupied the various fortified ports, portal citadels in the southern kingdom, right? So they are subcontracted this local resources to provide with an effective defense of the same ports through their de facto permanent fleets, right? This is really typical, especially in the 13th century. But it was also a pretty habitual practice, like for great powers to use at this point the Latin forces in this way. The interception occurred in the waters between the islands of Monte Cristo and Giglio off the Tuscan coast. Enzo, Frederick's illegitimate son by a German concubine and already a proven commander in both land and naval warfare, played prominent roles in coordinating the attack and in the subsequent distribution of prisoners and booty, leveraging the bonds of familial loyalty that tied him closely to his father's strategic designs across multiple theaters. Right? He was created King of Sardinia. The King of Sardinia would not quite survive as such, right? But this was a way also to trigger the peasants that, as you know, had pretty large amount of lands in Sardinia in a colonial fashion, and their the Hohenstaufen were trying to tie, of course, the island also to a broader Imperial Mediterranean project. The overburdened Genoese vessels, crowded with non-combatant prelates and their attendants, as well as with treasure destined for the papal cause, to finance the war, among other things, offered only weak resistance once the Imperial galleys closed. 3 ships were sunk by ramming or fire and spurring, or better, and 22 were captured intact, with approximately 2,000 men killed in the fighting, or drowned, and several thousand more, including the key papal legates James of Palestrina and Otto of San Nicola, taken prisoner, along with substantial treasuries of coin and plate. Right, this location is off essentially the Tuscan coast, like under Pisan control. So you can't simply intercept fleets right in the Middle Ages to blockade an entire stretch of sea, but you can't sort of ambush them as they pass by, right? And there was here a fortunate event also from the very capable Pisan marinere. The capture of so many high-ranking clergy disrupted papal coordination for years. It was a true disaster for the Gulf Coast and yielded significant financial resources, as we've seen, that were redirected into the imperial war chest. Right? They looted all this wealth that sort of made double damage, because it wasn't simply lost right to the enemy, but sort of the sense doubled from your side, right, as you gained it and the enemy lost it. The action successfully thwarted Gregory IX's projected council and allowed Frederick to advance his forces toward Rome itself. In the following months, though, he ultimately withdrew upon receiving news of the Pope's death on August the 22nd, 1241. I detailed these events in the aforementioned video about Frederick II's siege of Rome. Gregory's passing created a brief interregnum during which Frederick sought to influence the election of a more compliant successor, especially by keeping his army outside of the Urbs and sort of exercising the deterrence, right? But the eventual elevation of Sinibaldo Fieschi as Innocent IV in 1243 only intensified the war. In fact, under Innocent IV, who proved a more formidable and determined opponent than his predecessors, the struggle renewed with increased bitterness. The popes were incredibly self-aware of their situation. They understood the papal states could not simply last as an independent polity had the Lombard League collapsed in warfare, and so there had to be a response against the emperor. Here I'm also making things really simple in chronological evenemential terms, right? We are mostly concentrated on the Lombard League per se. Innocent eventually fled Rome for the relative safety of Lyon, between the Empire and France. We are in 1244, and there convened a council in 1245 that formally deposed Frederick from both the imperial and Sicilian thrones, escalating the papal imperial struggle into an open contest for the allegiance of Christendom. The Council of Lyon is important also for other reasons overall, of ecclesiastical matter, of heresy, and so on, but this had the broader purpose of essentially putting the emperor at his place, so to say. Parma. I have a couple of videos on the city. This was a Ghibelline stronghold, but it had been seized now by a Guelph faction through a carefully prepared coup that involved local nobles linked by kingship and interest to the papal court, rebelling against imperial authority in the summer of 1247. Parma's strategic location on the Via Emilia and its control of the surrounding fertile plain, but especially of the Cisa Pass, that connected, in fact, the region to Tuscany from the other side, made it a critical flashpoint for the control of Emilia-Romagna, in this case, from a longitudinal point of view along the Via Emilia, prompting Frederick to divert major military resources from other fronts to quell this rebellion in the north once again. He installed a trusted captain as temporary governor of the remaining loyal districts and laid formal siege to the city, while simultaneously constructing a heavily entrenched camp named Vittoria, in vernacular, A short distance away, complete with wooden houses for the troops, more elaborate residences for the higher nobility, and even a church intended to serve as the nucleus of a future imperial city that would permanently dominate the rebellious territory. All right, and so with the intent of actually raising Parma to the ground, so establishing victory. Remember the soul of chivalry, the winged glory tradition, right? That obviously a ruler like Frederick would constantly pursue, right? And Vittoria was indeed as such envisioned as a lasting symbol of imperial dominance. A planned urban foundation that would replace the rebellious commune as the administrative center of the region along the Via Emilia as a sort of Roman colony, right? Vittoria became the see of the same Frederick's court with this incredibly lavish spectacles, display of power aimed at intimidating the Parmesans and devastating their vast agricultural countryside. As you know, the Emilian area is a very agricultural area. There aren't the industries of Lombardy. So there are more popular forces. They're rising, a bit like Tuscany, that here is a bit out of radar, but had its own flourishing communal civilization. It would take essentially yet another generation to fully boom and sort of to enter. Also, as we've seen in many videos about Florence and other cities, into that sort of protagonistic stance, also in resisting against Holy Roman emperors for that matter. And so there is almost like a parabola, right, development here, how the situation developed. In fact, investment lasted many months and was accompanied by a growing number of desertions among the noble contingents whose terms of feudal service had long expired and who found the conditions of a prolonged winter siege. This is very characteristic of, again, Italian warfare since the times of Charlemagne that took 9 months to have Pavia capitulate. This is unheard of elsewhere. You have to concentrate an immense amount of resources on top of this, spend this enormous amount of resources for the court and all these constructions, these buildings, these spectacles, these shows, and so on. So this became increasingly intolerable. Right, these desertions reflected the structural strains inherent in relying also upon feudal levies for extended campaigns far from their home territories. On February 18th, 1248, while Frederick himself was absent from the camp on a hunting expedition in the nearby Taro Valley, a major Guelph sortie issued from 2 of the city gates. This was almost a mystical event. The Parmesan chronicles that obviously took great pride in the outcome of this described this as literally the people of Parma coming out of the gates and overwhelming this most powerful emperor, true king of kings, right, in a royal sacred sense. Remember that here there is all an apocalyptic sort of symbolism regarding Frederick that also, according to the Joachimite prophecies, was increasingly seen as the Antichrist. There are very beautiful chronicles described, for example, the one of Salimbene from Parma, the remembered events, that was a Joachimite, but also at the death of Frederick in 1250 said, I believed he was the Antichrist. I was truly convinced, but when he died, the world did not end. This didn't happen by the second coming of Christ. So I was wrong, right? You have this very interesting visions, like in an incredibly spiritually dynamic Italy. Just the other day I made that video about mendicant art, and so these are actually the years, right? And years of, again, the incredible moral renovation, but also terrible warfare, and perhaps exactly because of this link. The attacking Parmesan force consisted, however, more concretely of the Communal knights, dense formations of pikemen, and a large contingent of the armed populace of Parma, admittedly, and it fell upon the Imperial camp with sudden violence. We'll never know what really happened, in the sense that, how the Parmesans managed to catch the Imperial camp by surprise, so they had probably coordinated with the absence of Frederick, but this turned out in a major victory for the Parmesans to truly storm the Victorian camp of Frederick. The Taro Valley, by the way, rich in game and water by clear streams provided the hunting grounds that reflected Frederick's lifelong passion for falconry, famously enough, and the observation of nature, interests that he documented at length in his treatise De Arte Venandi cum Avibus, a work that combined practical instruction with careful empirical description of the behavior of birds. But definitely this did not help much the situation. The Saracen troops stationed in the camp rushed out impulsively to meet the Parmesan attack, many of them without their bows and more intent on the prospect of plunder than an orderly resistance. In the ensuing confusion, in fact, the entire camp was overrun and set ablaze by the Guelphs, with roughly 100 Imperial knights and 1,500 infantry falling into captivity. Together with the Carroccio of Cremona, so the Ghibelline Carroccio of Cremona, interestingly enough, which had been brought as a symbol of Ghibelline solidarity, so with the emperor as well, likewise captured. Right? It's very interesting how these municipal trophies obviously were sort of lost and won. It's a bit like, I don't know, the Roman legionary eagles, right? The standards, the sense of this is your entire honor that is basically seized. The loss of the Cremonese Carroccio, in fact, mirrored the earlier symbolic defeat at Cortenuova, retributionally enough, and provided a powerful boost to Guelph morale throughout the region. Frederick, returning too late to retrieve the situation, retreated with the remnants of his army to the fortified town of Borgo San Donnino, more upriver on the Po. This orderly retreat preserved the core of his remaining forces for future operations and allowed a measure of reorganization, even though the material and prestige losses were severe, to say the least. The defeat at Vittoria, emblematic of the indiscipline that could overtake even experienced armies when surprised and leaderless, spurred a wave of Guelph advances across Emilia and Romagna and encouraged further uprisings that steadily eroded imperial holdings in central Italy as well. We are not looking, again, at the central Italian theater. Frederick fights there a lot as well. There are very interesting battles. We said before, Viterbo, Cingoli, etc. There's the siege of Rome. We don't look at that because it's not the Lombard League. But obviously, these other Italian communes were fighting also alongside that league in a way. In May 1249, we have another majorly important battle in medieval European warfare. Bolognese forces under the podesta Filippo Ugoni and the military leadership of Bishop Ottaviano Ubaldini, reinforced by allied contingents from other League cities and numbering around 4,000 cavalry and 3,000 infantry with later additions, advanced against the Ghibelline stronghold of Modena. Right. What is interesting about this is that in the backdrop of the broader clash between universal powers and sort of also these national characters, even though everything was very blended, as you understand, there is a lot of local factionalism, right? Bologna and Modena hate each other, just like Brescia and Bergamo. Bologna is also, as we've seen, a pretty big, important city. It is the properest and oldest university center in Europe. It has also, as we've seen here, backed historically both imperial, now especially the papal, the Guelph, Lombard prerogatives. Modena is a smaller center, and for different reasons, it's more conservative. It sides with the emperor, also to escape, in fact, the Lombard League's broader expansion. Right, that's what minor centers tend to do. Right, that's like, I don't know, emperor siding with the plebs as opposed to with the nobility. Right, the more developed establishment usually tends to oppose the monarchy, whereas the smaller powers tend to be coopted by it. Interestingly enough, Ubaldini was a prelate drawn from a prominent Florentine family and possessed marked military inclinations, exemplifying the frequent blurring of lines between ecclesiastical office and secular command that characterized the Guelph coast in this period, but not only. Right? Warrior bishops were a thing in the Holy Roman Empire, in Spain, etc. You do find them in different countries at different points. And King Heinz of Sardinia, commanding Modenese and Cremonese contingents that may have total as many as 15,000, even though, again, on the numbers, as always, please see these battles when I reconstruct them in standalone videos based on primary sources and tactical reconstruction. When an allied Ghibelline forces were counted, chose to take the offensive rather than await a siege, right? And near the village of Fossalta on the Panaro River, the Bolognese infantry did something really astonishing, right? It's not to be seen in any other medieval context. Basically, alone, like they were also waiting for the gathering of forces. Here, remember the contrast between the milites and the petites, so the consular class, so to say, and the popular. Well, we've seen it also in the video about the War of the First Lombard League, and basically these guys, they're not like each other very much. They fight together, right, knights and footmen, but they also do so autonomously. And at some point, before awaiting their own knights, the Bolognese foot cross the Panaro River without any cover, without any support, and go alone as a sole infantry force against the Ghibelline Modenese host that has knights, infantry, all the tactical complement. Right? This is a massive display of courage, probably the peak of Italian, not infantry development, because that would skyrocket later in especially combined armed tactics with cavalry during the so-called Signoria of Popolo in the early 14th century. Those are literally the single most advanced armies in the Middle Ages. This one is the peak of infantry as a standalone force, right? And that's the reason why later you don't see infantry-only victories in Italy, even though they had the finest army, because they actually didn't have any need to fight without their cavalry. At this point, instead, the political precondition made it the case. And so, in order to show their power in front of their own aristocracy, they crossed the watercourse. It's something unique. Normally, infantry at this point, like not just lost against cavalry, but also against combined armed tactics from the other side, and always took a defensive stand. We've seen it at Cortenmao, we've seen it at Legnano. Admittedly, at Carcano, as we've seen in the previous episode, there had been something similar, but not in the face of the enemy, just to sack the enemy camp after having been broken. Here, instead, the Bolognese is also this Emilian infantry that is starting to bloom, sort of after the Lombard one that had historically been the precursor of everything, crosses the watercourse by means of a partially completed bridge. By the way, so these footmen, also as craftsmen, etc., they had their own technical skills. After receiving timely warning, by the way, from woodcutters working in the adjacent forests, and they formed themselves into ordered ranks on the far bank in time to withstand the initial charge of the Imperial cavalry. Instead of preserving themselves, they literally go out for it. Probably also to lure the enemy, but literally withstanding the full might. Remember, I repeat it, this is the peak in medieval warfare of knightly combat, right? Both morally and technically. These Bolognese infantrymen go for it, outside, alone, right, in open field against the full might of Imperial cavalry, right? So the successful crossing, among other things, of the Panaro here demonstrated the adaptive use of incomplete infrastructure in the fluid conditions of open field battle, turning a potential vulnerability into an actual tactical opportunity, at least from the Bolognese footman side. Now, Allied cavalry that had been at this point foraging in the nearby countryside crossed the river as well farther downstream and struck the Imperial flank at a critical moment. Some very fine combined armed tactics, and also reflecting how this normally worked. Like it was actually the opposite normally. It was the infantry scattered across the countryside that foraged, and there was some cavalry reserve somewhere ready to intervene in case somebody attacked the scattered guys. Here's reversed, right? This is incredible in terms of European infantry development. This is a massive chapter for Salta. Foraging parties necessarily dispersed to gather the supplies required by large armies operating far from their bases, by the way, frequently determined the outcome of engagements by their ability to reassemble rapidly when battle was joined. Before we sent 4,000 knights, this is an exaggeration telling the truth again, more of numbers another time, but only the fact that Bologna alone could field realistically several hundred knights and thousands of footmen just as a regular contribution make the math for all the Italian communities. Like, it's something utterly insane, right? After successive stands, first in the dry torrent bed of Fossalta itself and then near the church of St. Lazarus, the Ghibelline forces finally routed. Enzo himself was unhorsed and famously captured. And in fact, Enzo's subsequent imprisonment in Bologna, where he remained until his death in 1272, with all comfort by some extent, frequented by women. Apparently, he was sort of incredibly beautiful, right? Prototype of Swabian Germanic beauty with long flowing hair, in line with that Minnesänger kind of warrior bard kind of style. Underscores, however, the incredible bitterness of his prisonate. That also is one of the many facets of the devastating, the really tragic end of the Hohenstaufen. Right, and this is also the place where a palace was eventually renamed in Bologna in Enzo's honor, right, becoming a lasting symbol of communal defiance, by the way, and of the irreversible decline of direct Hohenstaufen power in northern Italy. Bologna was incredibly proud of obviously having captured a king, just as much as the Parmesans had destroyed sort of the victory of Frederick, literally. And this will definitely compound communal identity, pride, power, and so on. And the action at Fossalta demonstrated the capacity of Bolognese infantry to advance beyond natural obstacles to form disciplined squares in open ground against fresh cavalry that they were willing to take on. That's the badassery of these people. And to transition effectively to the counterattack once supported by their own mounted troops, marking a tactical evolution within the enduring defensive parameters that had characterized communal warfare since the previous century. This development built directly upon the hard lessons of earlier engagements, such as we see in Cortenuova, where, after all, Lombard infantry had successfully withstood Imperial cavalry charges until dusk, and Brescia, enhancing the offensive potential of citizen armies when they could coordinate closely with allied cavalry. Right, they're all citizen cavalry for that matter. Modena's own infantry, by contrast, suffered heavy losses in prisoners and displayed little capacity for independent action once their mounted contingent had been broken. But the only truth, there's later Modenese history that sort of brings some sort of regard to their foot capacity. Bologna was a much more civically strong center in many ways. The varying performance of Modena's forces also highlighted the significant differences in military effectiveness that did exist among the communal armies of different cities at a time. I mean, they were quite homogeneous, but the factor here that changes is morale, leadership, civic cohesion, general political unity, differences rooted in local traditions of training, or at least in the way they would end up sort of successful deploying their troops, the relative strength of noble and popular factions, and the quality of leadership. So a decent excuse to cut this video short, because of course it's too long. As you know, I have also technical means. I can't at the moment sort of export videos that are longer than 2 hours and a half or something, my thing, but is that we promptly sort of wisely stopped just to the Lombard League clashes. All right. And so we mostly stop here because, yes, there are battles, there are events. Here's not the history of Frederick, right? It's not even the history of the Lombard League. It's the military history of the Lombard League and Frederick. It's different, all right? And we can sort of summarize certain aspects that we have seen. We will surely make videos about all these battles, as I always say, in this general panorama. Because Italian politics becomes complicated. It already is very much at this point. So the history of these Lombard cities also goes on by itself, right? We need to terminate the just engagement because the main clashes were fought at this point. It's actually all much more complicated, but these were essentially the major engagements that are necessary to recount. Then again, I have plenty of other videos about Frederick II. I will be making lots of others. You don't have to worry. Also about the Lombard army, about Frederick's army, and beyond. There is a papal army at this point. There are lots of other forces involved. The various maritime republics, fleets, the various mercenaries from different places, this various also polyurcetic machines, and so on. We'll carefully look at the Carroccio, for example, the Saracens of Lucera. So throughout the long struggle, Lombard tactics consistently leveraged the distinctive terrain of the region: rivers, canals, drainage ditches, seasonal marshes, and scattered woods for both immediate battlefield shelter and broader strategic lines of defense, developing from the occasional exploitation of natural obstacles into the deliberate construction of defensive frameworks that included prepared camp trenches, earthen ramparts, and fortified bridgeheads. The extensive canal networks of the Po Valley, many of them remnants of Roman engineering projects later expanded by medieval communes for purposes of irrigation, land reclamation, and inland transport, amplified these advantages and simultaneously supported the movement of supplies along protected water routes. This approach fostered the development of semi-permanent field fortifications that, while distinct from the more rigid models of classical Roman castramentation, prefigured certain later Renaissance developments in military architecture undertaken by engineers in the service of Venice, Milan, and other Italian states, especially during the first half of the 14th century. We have some massive military engineering that the same Italians at some point start describing in their own chronicles. Look, here, staying at the story, we actually surpassed, Caesar's fortifications at Alesia, right? Infantry, whether the pikemen of Milan, if we have to be, again, stereotypical, again, Milan had a fully developed army of knights, pikemen, crossbowmen, and more. The hardened contingents of Alessandria or Bologna, or the specialized crossbowmen of Genoa, repeatedly anchored their positions around the Carroccio, absorbing the impetus of cavalry charges until the moment when a coordinated counteroffensive became possible. Otherwise, more conventional engagements would be fought otherwise, but as we've seen here, actually infantry is always protagonistic, so it was not decisive, but we don't have, say, at this point, like a frontal clash, right? Before Cortenuova, that was somehow possible. We've seen it also at the same battle, a reduced battle of Cortenuova, some initial engagement that was normal in this feudal era between knights, right? Before the Lombards broke and they passed to the infantry, including with dismounted knights. So warfare sort of declines itself on the basis of all this. Like here, of these circumstances, right? It's quite fascinating to see how, of course, in warfare, there's never a battle that like another, tactically wise. Everything, there is never a full tactical module that works always in the same way. There are admittedly times in which this is the case, but also how the battle goes, it's always different by degrees. We sent Genoese crossbowmen. There's a bit this idea that just Genoa had the sort of the best crossbow, but actually there's not much of an evidence that they weren't necessarily the best per se. Like the Italians in general had already this professional contingents quite honed in warfare, sort of drawing upon expertise acquired. It's said for the maritime republics developed it more because of naval warfare and mercenary service across the Mediterranean. We don't really have an evidence of this, right? You could say, like the Venetians were the best, I don't know, at amphibious operations because they were the top maritime republic. Really, at some point, they fail at that. So this really depends on the single unit, on the single fleet, the single army, right? This was, as we explained before, so a pretty homogeneous type of warfare developed in Italy, providing crucial range support, in this case with the crossbows, with the powerful arbalete that could penetrate the armor of even well-protected knights at moderate distances. There's a very interesting development also in the length of cavalry and infantry ranks, as we'll talk about this better for, if anything, the second half of the 13th century warfare. Lots of things going on. The Pavese is born more or less around the end of this timeline. Now, Frederick's composite armies integrated instead German heavy knights, Sicilian Saracens of Lucera, and Italian Ghibelline contingents under regional commanders such as Ezzelino III da Romano, who secured lasting control over Verona, Vicenza, and Padua through this combination of strategic alliances, calculated marriages, and ruthless elimination of opposition, serving for many years as Imperial vicar in the Mark of Treviso. This is yet another Italian force per se, right? Ezzelino's rules, with his connection with Frederick, involved the harsh suppression of any potential challenge, contributing substantially to the era's growing reputation, at least for the emergence of quote-unquote tyrannical signori who rose to power amid the disorders of the Papal Imperial wars, right? Even though these were some of the most sort of republican governments in Europe, actually. So if these were tyrants, what about, monarchs, kings, the same Frederick? Yet the sustained nature of the operations continually strained the resources of even the emperor's well-organized state, importantly enough, as evidenced by the resort to leather coinage and the repeated necessity of mustering fresh contingents from Germany and the south. The leather tokens that supplemented shortages of silver illustrated the fiscal innovations at the same time born of necessity during this prolonged war that neither side could bring to a decisive conclusion at the end of the day, even though sort of surviving for the Lombard League was sort of a victory in itself. They preserved what they needed to preserve. The overall struggle encompassing the imperial tactical success at Cortenuova, the failed siege of Brescia, the prolonged investments of Faenza and Parma, the novel interception of Giglio, and the defeats at Vittoria and Fossalta gradually exhausted the material and human resources of both parties. Right, but Frederick was less advantaged in this because his main bases were more distant. Right, these campaigns drained manpower and treasuries across northern and central Italy as well, weakening the traditional structures of communal government, even as they preserved the principle of urban autonomy. Right, actually, after this period, the real boom of Italian civilization happened. Right, so yes, so these resources absorbed an enormous amount of material, but at the same time, right, this was a continuum. Medieval civilization was expanding like crazy, right, and the Lombard League was better in effectively intercepting the momentum. Ezzelino's later excommunication by the church and his eventual capture and death in 1259, 9 years after the death of the Saint Frederick, after the Battle of Cassano d'Adda, he was mortally wounded there, underscored the shifting political tides that followed the emperor's own demise. Right, Cassano d'Adda marked a significant wealth victory in the post-Frederick era, very time of Manfred, and contributed directly to the final decline of coherent imperial influence in Lombardy. In the following year, you have Montaperti, as a matter of fact. We were hinting at it at the beginning of the video, and I made, in fact, an entire video on that as well, the times and meaning of Montaperti. Then we'll make an entire video about the tactical reconstruction through primary sources. But there you have still at least Manfred of Sicily that is trying to successfully re-extend German control, secular German control on Tuscany, at least by co-opting the local Ghibellines. It's a wholly different chapter. It doesn't really end until further 6 and 8 years later with Benevent and Tagliacozzo, but that's yet another era, so to say, fairly distant, in fact, from the same Frederick's era, right? Almost a generation later. So it's actually a huge history, a huge tapestry, the threads of which you have to politically and strategically follow very carefully. All right, it's very famous history, admittedly, for those who know medieval history for real, but it's also indeed very complex. There is really a lot of stuff in it. It's hyper-documented reality. You have to be aware of all the details in this, right? And this has been, in a way, even studied more, right? At least as far as Florence eventually takes off, and there is a great attention that eventually stems also from the Renaissance, paradoxically through that. So be always aware of how and why we study this stuff, because it's never random, right? There is never no reason for the way you would create a historical narrative to begin with. Frederick's death on December the 13th, 1250, at the castle of Fiorentino in Apulia, after a period of illness contracted during a campaign in the southern provinces, effectively concluded this epic phase of communal resistance. His passing in the heart of his Sicilian kingdom amid symptoms that contemporary observers associated with dysentery or similar acute disease allowed the achievements of the League to solidify as the remaining Hohenstaufen forces fragmented under the pressure of continued papal hostility and internal rivalries. This is the age of Manfred of Sicily, actually restored power. This is also the one of Conrad IV that arrived, his half brother, the legitimate son and king of Conrad IV, properly of Germany, that died in Italy, fighting against the Papal States. Shall make a biography about him. This is the father of Conrad in Swabia, so we don't need to remind the painful end of the Swabian dynasty down the line. But it didn't happen from a day to another, actually. At Frederick's death, some said that there was some sort of resurgence or reactivation. You could never really say, but as a matter of fact, the ultimate outcome witnessed this bulk of the Lombard League's resistance in the north that collected victories, right, and really did not leave much space for any grander project, really, at least in the moment. The League's endurance through more than 2 decades of warfare, in fact, preserved substantial measures of urban autonomy, even amid the gradual emergence of the lordships, right, of the signoria, and its shape that would become sort of smoothly as some sort of greater endowment of podestas or sort of similar offices. And in fact, there is a wide age, like there are multiple generations of the so-called signories of Popolo that were actually the peak of also the Italian communal rule, not much in a principalities, regional state, monarchic, dynastic sense, like it would mostly develop toward the end of the Middle Ages. This would shape the contours of northern Italy long after the emperor's death, and actually would usher in in fact, an incredibly booming moment, like probably the peak of medieval military civilization with Italian armies that we made videos on. It were something utterly insane just by numbers and by scale of the troop, of numbers of the single hosts, but also probably the amount of these hosts, right, and how frequently they were mobilized. In a couple of generations, there were millions of men in arms. We can't distinctly count them in all the different armies of more than 10,000, in the tens of thousands that we count in several tens, all right, at the beginning of the 14th century. So it's an entire era of warfare that for some reason has been completely missing in historiography. It's not really minor, it's not a detail, a secondary thing. It's literally the single most important and military active region in Europe by scale, by power, and this is also, so speaking of the incredibly low level of actual medieval military historical culture that exists in the world up to this point. The Middle Ages is not the fair of provincialism where you can decide just based on where you come from, which is the most powerful place in front of the evidence, right? You have to consider the entirety of Europe if you want to have at least to have a meaningful understanding in any objective or accurate sense of what armies were the most advanced, right, in the continent. Also considering that the continent was disentwined, we've seen it in today's video too, right? Now, this legacy influenced the subsequent, in fact, rise of properly powerful city-states, such as Milan under the Visconti dynasty, and contributed to the conditions that later permitted the cultural and intellectual flowering of the Renaissance in the region, where the preserved traditions of communal liberty and civic patronage fostered an environment in which artistic and scholarly activity could flourish with unusual intensity, together, in fact, with the single most civic and military culture in the Middle Ages, right? This is how important the wars of the Second Lombard League are. They are sort of, if you think about it, less iconic than the First Lombard League, not because actually there was less warfare, right? In the first case, they were more clamorous, perhaps, as a relative novelty, right, for what the relation had been with the emperor. Here, as we observe today with the structure of the video itself, it's literally how it went historically. I mean, there were lots of other things going on, including other wars across Italy and beyond. There are Frederick's expeditions to the east. There is so Papal invasion of southern. So lots of other stuff happening. But in this context, aside from the importance of single battles, Cortenuova, Fossalta, etc., for probably the tactical history of medieval armies, you realize that there isn't properly, as always, a popular understanding, I would say, of the importance of these phases. Like, you hear that these things happen. I've always had people focusing, rightly so on my channel, whenever I talk about the Swabians, oh my god, I want to hear more about Frederick II and everything. But at the end of the day, right, when it comes to his opponents, like, people tend to see these communes as some sort of scattered forces that, on the occasion face them without even knowing exactly what happened in these battles or why they're important in the history of the art of war. Is that, I don't know, you have 3 million views on the Battle of Courtrai, right? That was not even as big as, this one's, right? But this is the problem. I want to check actually on YouTube here. If someone has conceptualized the Second Lombard League, for example, Second Lombard League, there isn't even an entry on this. There is only Legnano. There is some of my videos, Barbarossa. So basically, in the entire YouTube, I am the only person talking about this, as always. Anyway, whichever topic, it ends up being, sadly enough, always the same old story. I think, well, it's good for me. I see, for example, my videos here on the Wars of the First Lombard League getting more views, right? This chapter was warranted as far as, of course, the completion of this story in the general sort of military substance for the entire sort of more international political backdrop of Frederick's life and reign and so on. But again, if you don't focus on these actors, if you still reason by, I don't know, total war factions or internet memes or whatever you think history is, I think I'm very disappointed at YouTube and sort of the general. I'm very disappointed at people in general when it comes to historical knowledge and beyond. Like, you have the internet, you have all this stuff. You don't even care about creating a space that talks about this stuff. I mean, what kind of cultural dignity, if any, you have, right? Don't you feel insulted by yourself of not even dedicating yourself to this stuff? Like, this, like saying to creators, whoever, the bigger channels in particular, like, you cover some of the most, I would say, not necessarily even unimportant topics, but let's say, of all the broader range of stuff you've covered, major wars, whatever, why is this not here? I just searched, I just typed, there's not, right? This is really unfortunate and horrifying, telling the truth. And it's always an incredibly disappointing journey. And whenever you find anything here, Cortenuova, there is only here, I presume, an Italian video I just typed of 16 minutes. What the hell do you want to say in 16 minutes? Let's say Fossalta, at least these. Nothing. Nothing. It's not possible. Maybe if I add battle. Yes, there are, but they're just video games of Wikipedia pages. So there isn't. Right, Wikipedia pages of 3 minutes or a reenactment or a Total War 15 minutes thing from a mod. This is all there is, right? Say Battle of Cortenuova, for example. Literally only one. No, actually there are another couple like 8 minutes long. This is part of a documentary. Here, the same Wikipedia entries, and this is also one of my videos, nothing. So basically, this is ridiculous. This is utterly ridiculous. But in any case, we have to be patient because we're going to cover these topics anyway. So I'm really glad that at least we made the second chapter, so to say, about the Wars of the Lombard League. We'll talk more about its armies, its battles. We'll talk more about Frederick II. I already sent this. And I would say that for today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.